Tollette stood over the hot stove, wiping her hands on her apron with a keen gaze over each bubbling pot. There were no written recipes to be found. Instead, each one of them were etched in her mind, as old as time itself, passed down from her mother and her grandmother before. The kitchen smelled of chicken and dumplings and cornbread. But it was the aroma of the sweetness coming from the oven that caught my attention. "Granny, what kind of pie you cooking? It sure smells good," I asked.
"Well, child, I can't keep no secrets from your nose, can I?"
Granny Tollette smiled as she stirred the dumplings.
"It's apple pie, with just a pinch of cinnamon. Every time I bake an apple pie, my mind always drifts back to that time Sally Ann baked an apple pie for the revival. Did I ever tell you that story?"
"I don't reckon you have, Granny," I said as I took a chair at the kitchen table, just as Granny pulled the golden brown pie out of the oven. Just then, Granny began.
"Talk about apple pie. There never was a more astonishing apple pie than the one Sally Ann beat up for the all-day preaching that went on down at Harmony Baptist Church a few years ago. Now, back in those days, folks came to the preachings from all over the countryside, as far away as Sandy Creek and Turkey Bottom, even Huggins Crossroads. And they brought all their dinners with them, and between all the sermons and the singing that went on in the morning and the afternoon, they'd spread their victuals all over the ground, picnic style, I tell you, and a finer spread of food you never saw. All the women folk tried to outdo everybody else, with their pies and their cakes and their roast chicken and whatnot, and Sally Ann had her mind set to have an apple pie that would top everything else at the revival. She started on it on an early Wednesday morning, mixing up her meal and molasses, cutting up the apples and such fixings to make it extra fancy. After she'd had it on the fire a spell, it came to her that she forgot to put the salt in it. Now every good cook knows that a pie's not right without a pinch of salt. So Sally Ann called out to her oldest girl, Mabel, "Honey, I forgot to put the salt in the pie, and I'm out here plucking the chicken, and my fingers are all stuck full of feathers. Run in the kitchen for me and put a good big pinch of salt in it." "I can't, Ma. I'm a-ironing my dress for the big doings tomorrow. If I stop now, my iron'll get cold." And she went on just a-ironing just as hard as she could. Hearing this, Sally Ann hollered out to her next oldest gal, "Hitty, will you run in the kitchen and put some salt in that pudding for me? I declare goodness, Ma, I can't do it. I just been to the granny woman down on Dry Branch to get her to take the warts off my hands, and she smeared axle grease all over both my hands and told me not to wash it off till I saw the evening star over my left shoulder. I can't pick up a pinch of salt with axle grease all over my hands." By that time, Sally Ann was might nigh wore out with hollering and such, but she decided to try once more. "Essie, can you run in the kitchen and put some salt in that pudding for me? Golly, Ma, I'm a-lying here in the bed with cucumber peelings all over my face, trying to bleach the freckles off before tomorrow. I can't get up now. Ask Miley to do it." Now, Miley was the youngest daughter, and naturally she was spoiled plumb rotten, and Sally Ann thought she'd give it a shot, so she called out, "Miley, get yourself in the kitchen and throw some salt in that pudding for me. Goodness sakes, Ma, I'm working like a fire to get my hair rolled up on old stockings, so I'll have curls for the get-together tomorrow. I ain't got time to salt that pie." Now, by now, Sally Ann had plumb run out of gals to ask, so she hollered to her only son, "Thomas, please go in the kitchen and throw a spoonful of salt in that pie for me." But you see, Thomas was busy too. Oh, he was a young, handsome fella that all the girls at church were crazy about. And he had just about reached the age where he was starting to notice them back, and he was aiming to do a little courting tomorrow. Just then he answered his mama,
"I can't, Ma. I'm full of bear's grease, since I've been slicking down my hair with it. And now I'm a-greasing my Sunday go-to-meeting boots. I can't put any salt in that pie right now."
Now, by that time, all the children were used up, so Sally Ann began to holler at her old man, "Parson, can you stop whatever you're doing and go put a spoonful of salt in that apple pie?"
"Oh, I can't do it now, Mama. I'm cleaning my gun for tomorrow. Supposing a nice fat rabbit ran across the road while we were a-going. If my gun wasn't ready, we'd miss a good rabbit stew for supper. I got my hands full of gun soot. I can't take care of your pie right now."
"Oh, tarnation," Sally Ann thought to herself. She was clean out of patience. "I'll do it myself." She went and washed the feathers off her hand, and she marched right into the kitchen. She got a good big pinch of salt, and went over to the hearth where the bowl of apples and the sugar and the flour and the cinnamon were sitting, and she threw it in. Well, after a while, Mabel got her dress all done up, and she started to feel a little ashamed that she hadn't done what her mama had asked her, So she went over to the salt box and got a big pinch and threw it into the mixture. Edie got to feeling bad about refusing Ma, too. "I reckon I could put a pinch of salt in that pie if I tried," she said. And then she went into the kitchen. She picked up a spoon with her black greasy hands and dipped a big dose of salt and stirred it in the bowl. Then Essie was lying back on the bed with her face all covered up with cucumbers. And she got to thinking that she hadn't done right not to help her Ma when she was asked. So she got up, she went to the hearth, and she put some more salt in the mixture. No sooner than she'd got out of the way than Miley came into the kitchen with her hair done up in knobs all over her head. She got a good-sized pinch of salt and she dropped it in with the apples. And Thomas, he got to thinking about it after he finished his boots. So in the kitchen he went, and he dipped up a good big tablespoon. Being a boy and all, he didn't know much about such things, and he thought you had to put as much salt in the apple pie as a pot of stew. Well, directly, Paul's conscience got to hurting him too, and as soon as his gun was all shined up and loaded, he clumped into the kitchen, dipping a heaping spoonful of salt, and he threw it over in the bowl of apples and stirred it up real nice. At last, the apple pie was done, and Sally Ann took it off the fire. It turned out of the pot just as pretty as you please. "That's as fine a looking apple pie I've ever saw," Sally Ann thought to herself. "With a pie like that, I might even ask the preachers to have some tomorrow." Well, anyways, the next day was just as sparkling and as sunny as you ever saw. Everybody set off, walking to the church. Some of the finest preaching that ever came out of Galax Cove happened that morning. As soon as one preacher was winded, another one got up and took his place. By 12 o'clock, they were all knocked out, so they called time for the big dinner. Well, I tell you, Sally Ann was so proud of that apple pie that sure enough, she invited all the preachers over to have some, and there was 4 of them. So she cut off 4 huge hunks and told them to dig in. The first one that took a bite looked at Sally Ann with his eyes half popping out of his head. "You never tasted anything like that, now did you?" Sally Ann asked all proud like.
"No, sister. I don't believe I ever tasted anything like this, and that's a fact,"
the preacher said with his cheeks all drawed up. "Go on now, don't be bashful. Finish it up," Sally Ann urged the poor fella, who was doing his best not to hurt her feelings. So he took another bite and gulped it down. Those 4 preachers sure proved their Christian faith that day. All 4 of them choked down that pie. After that, they staggered off towards the church. Sally Ann cut out some for herself and passed each of her family a piece. Everybody took a bite and looked up, horrified. Then out came how each of them had gone into the kitchen and saw to the apple pie. Sally Ann was plumb mortified. And it spoilt the preaching, too. You can be sure of that. Those preachers didn't save any souls that afternoon. As soon as one of them would get started all worked up to a hollering pitch, he'd have to stop and whisper for a glass of water. I reckon there was so much water hauled up to the pulpit that day that folks stopped thinking about the preaching and began to wonder what all the trouble was. Some folks even took to counting the glasses. What, with preachers plagued with thirst and everybody whispered to each other and asking questions? The meeting broke up way ahead of time. I tell you, the tale about Sally Ann's famous apple pie and the day the preachers got all choked up has made folks grin in Galax Cove ever since.
Just then, Granny Tollette pulled a small plate from the cabinet, and she cut me a small slice of her pie. She leaned down towards me and she smiled.
Now, J.D., don't you go putting any salt in that.